risk management is significantly increased in terms of the detail and the MDR. Essentially, the MDR brings in 14971. If you believe that you're compliant with 13485 2016, that already brings a lot of risk management aspects into your quality management system, and a lot of that is then duplicated into the MDR. So generally compliant with 13485 16 brings you into compliance with the MDR. The big difference is that if you look at the MDD, I think risk is mentioned 56 times. Under the MDR, it's mentioned 250 times. So you can get the impression that it's very risk focused, and reducing risk is really important. If I look in detail at the SPRs and how they talk about risk, SPR1 talks again about that it will be safe and effective, and that it's state of the art and that it's safe over its lifetime, which is not really a significant difference to that in ER1 under the MDD. I think it's fair to say if you're then into SPR2 and it starts to talk about reducing the risks as far as possible, it's bringing those content deviations from 14971 into the MDR. So these words, reduced risks as far as possible without adversely affecting clinical benefit or benefit risk, is straight from the content deviations in 14971. SPR3 is a lot more detailed about what risk is. SPR4 talks about the risk controls adopted by manufacturers, and SPR4 really focuses on those content deviations from 14971. So if we look at, it says eliminate or reduce the risks as far as possible through safe design rather than informing users. But then when it talks about informing users, it says, provide information for safety warnings and contraindications by informing users, and then where appropriate, training to users. Under the MDR, it only talks about reducing the risk. It doesn't give you options for how you might do that. And I think this is really key, that it's starting to say that you might need to include training as a specific tool to reduce risk. SPR 5 and 8 also talk about risk and reducing the risks as far as possible, but they talk a little bit more about ergonomic features. So these used to be under Essential Requirement 1, but it talks about the ergonomic risk and how that's linked to the requirements of the user and the education of the user and how experienced they are with the device. Are you talking about a nurse that's just graduated, or are you talking about a nurse that's been in the job for 40 years? There's a big difference, and making sure that the ergonomic features are appropriate to the users that are going to use them. Is it a child using it? Is it an adult using it? Those kind of questions. And SPR 9 finally talks about those devices that are not medical purpose. So if I read the MDD, it talks about reducing the risk as far as possible and the benefits of the device always outweighing the risk. All of the information on the device, all of the clinical data, clinical investigations, scientific literature, peer-reviewed scientific literature, and the medical device regulation starts to say that it must be peer-reviewed scientific literature. It can't just be a collection of papers by the designing surgeon or designing author. It has to be peer-reviewed. It starts to talk about the clinical evaluation being planned and systematic. I think in the MDD it does say a methodologically sound procedure. That's not always very well understood, but now it starts to say that a methodologically sound, systematic and planned process. So you can't just get to the end of your device and go, well, I'm just going to put these papers together. You need to have defined how you gathered the data, you need to have planned how you gathered the data, and you need to have a procedure to do that. So it's a lot more detailed about what's required. Many manufacturers are already doing this. And finally, that there should be sufficient data and quality, so that a sufficient amount and quality to allow a qualified assessment. What does sufficient mean? it's a really qualitative word, and I think it's really hard to know what that is. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about what sufficient is between manufacturers and notified bodies and competent authorities. I think it needs to be that if sufficient information should be able to answer the question as to whether something is safe and is performing. And if you can't demonstrate that it's safe and you can't demonstrate that it's performing, it's probably not sufficient clinical data. So, as part of clinical evidence, we get into lots of discussions about equivalence and what is equivalence and what's the change between what we're doing now and what's required in the MDR. And this slide just gives you a bit more detail about MedDev 2.7.1 and the difference between the revision 3, revision 4, and what's required in the MDR. I think there was a big change between revision 3 and revision 4 in terms of the detail in the guidance. I don't think that there was inherently anything different in terms of what you should have been doing. It's just that revision 4 told you in more detail about what you should have been doing. So if you look at this slide, revision 4 started to say that there would be more detail in the specifications of technical properties, physiochemical properties, intensity of energy, and a little bit more about the critical performance requirements, but nothing that I don't think manufacturers were doing already. Revision 4 started to give a lot more detail about the biological equivalence of devices, so exceptions can be foreseen for devices in contact with intact skin and things. And it started to give more words about clinical, so used for the same clinical condition or intended purpose. So not just the intended purpose or the clinical condition, but both. So I guess what I'm getting to is that if you're revision 4 compliant, I think you're most of the way there. And I don't think, as a notified body, that revision 4 and revision 3 are that significant. They just give manufacturers a lot more detail about how to gather that detail or the data on clinical evidence and put it together. There are some significant differences between revision 4 and the MDR, and those are identified here in that the software algorithms are included for similar kind and duration of contact for those biological substances, and having the same kind of user under the clinical equivalent. And it does say that each device with equivalences claim must have full clinical, technical, and biological characteristics. So we're talking about one equivalent device. We're not talking about an equivalent device technically and another equivalent device biologically and another equivalent device clinically. We're talking one device that meets all of those requirements. So there's no Frankenstein, I think is what the MHRA call it, no Frankenstein approach to clinical equivalence. It has to be one device. The significant differences in equivalence under the MDR is that for class 3 devices and for implants, equivalence can only be claimed with the manufacturer's own device. And these are words out of the MDR. So you can only claim equivalence to your own devices or devices where the other manufacturer has a contract with you allowing you full access to all of the information on that device on an ongoing basis. And then for those other devices, not the class 3 or the implants or those other high-risk devices, then it says, for those other devices, only sufficient level of access.